So, for the benefit of anybody who's watching this recording, this is the meeting of the Tuesday night chanting group, and tonight we are it's the first Tuesday of February, and so on the first Tuesday of the month we have a discussion. The other Tuesday nights we actually chant, and we did just chant. We did the evening bell chant in the Great Dharani. Now we're going to talk about the Great Dharani. Okay, so. Um, the floor is open. The Great Dharani. There's a lot of things to talk about. We could talk about Dharanis in general and mantras in general and chanting practice in general, or specifically things having to do with the Great Dharani. Um, so it is whatever people are interested in talking about. Uh, it's always dangerous to just let me go on. Um, so please interrupt me. As things appear in your mind. Um, as I do have a couple of things I wanted to say. Uh, One is that I learned the Great Dharani uh, because that's teaching from Zen Master Sung San, and he taught all of his students to chant the Great Dharani. It was his practice, the chanting of the Great Dharani, holding the Great Dharani always as in his mind throughout his life. And uh, and so my teacher, Zen Master Degak, I learned it from him, not directly from Zen Master Sung San. And Zen Master Sung San was not big on explanations. He's very, very, very Zen, you know. But one time he did actually give an explanation for the Great Dharani. And it's somewhere. Uh, but he said that one time a monk had broken his vows and was very distraught. I don't know what vows it was, but it was something serious. He had done something bad. And felt very bad about it, and went to the Buddha, and the Buddha taught him the Great Dharani as a way of uh, cleansing his karma. Now, that's kind of that is an apocryphal story. Is a nice way of putting it. I think it's something that it's either something that Zen Master Sung San made up himself, or it's something that someone else made up and told him, or that he heard somewhere. Um, the actual the Great Dharani comes from a sutra, and I sent to anybody who's on the email list, and there'll be a link to this in the description of this YouTube video if anybody's watching the recorded version of this. The Great Dharani was taught in a sutra, um, uh, and that's where it comes from. and, and so there was a time when the Buddha was at uh, Potalaka, a semi-mythical location somewhere, possibly in India, um, a location very closely associated with Avalokiteshvara, and and actually I can't remember now. So even though mantras and Dharanis usually come from sutras, sometimes, especially with mantras and Dharanis that are associated with Avalokiteshvara, sometimes she's the one who actually teaches the Dharani, even though the Buddha is kind of the MC. So there are many sutras in which other people have important roles, and a lot of the talking or the important teaching may be done by someone else. Um, and there are there are sutras like that. There are also sutras that are about particular Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, in which, so like the Medicine Buddha Sutra, the Medicine Buddha isn't there. Shakyamuni Buddha talks about the Medicine Buddha in the Medicine Buddha Sutra. Shakyamuni Buddha teaches the Dharani that's associated with the Medicine Buddha, but the Medicine Buddha isn't there. There are other sutras where Avalokiteshvara steps forward and says, you know, permission to speak. And the Buddha says, oh, yeah, sure. and go ahead. And then Avalokiteshvara goes ahead and talks. And I can't remember which the case is with this, but the Dharani comes from a sutra. However, Zen Master Sung San's story about the Dharani actually refers to a very important way in which the Great Dharani is frequently used, and that people do use it to cleanse their karma. Um, and in fact, that's so people often uh, chant the Great Dharani just for getting benefit from it. For my favorite example is always that students often chant the Great Dharani, recite the Great Dharani before they take a test. So it gives them good luck on a test. And I've known people who've done that. Still have to study. Um, but and so it's kind of famous throughout East Asia as basically as a magic um, spell, that if you do this chant, uh, it will help you. And so that's for a lot of people. Where they um, that's where they're at with their. So that's one of the reasons for it being so popular, is because it has that reputation, and apparently it works for people because people keep doing it century after century. Um, this Buddhist teachers like to encourage people to take it kind of to the next level, and to say, "Oh yes, there's wonderful benefits that you get from it, but um, uh, you should think about even greater benefit, which is to advance on the bodhisattva path, and to um, which does require working with our whatever you want to call it. Buddhist, the Buddha called it, bad karma." And Zen Master Sung San, in the story that he told about the explanation for, where the Great Dharani comes from, he also said this monk had broken his vows, was very distraught, didn't know what to do, and the Buddha said, just chant the Great Dharani, and and it will cleanse your karma. Anyway, so that's a um, that was Zen Master Sung San's explanation, which he rarely gave explanations for anything. You say, why do we do this? He'd say, just go straight, or too much thinking, uh, which is always good advice. Yeah. Hi, John. Long time no see. So we're talking about the Great Dharani. You probably know that.
Yeah, I
What?
couldn't miss it.
Okay. um, so, does anybody here regularly recite the Great Dharani? I'm not trying to put anybody on the spot, but I do. Um,
I do.
it's it, it's good, isn't it? It's good, isn't it, John?
Oh yeah, it's the best.
Yeah, yeah. And in fact, uh, scholars who study the history of Buddhism, um, they actually wonder out loud, why is the Great Dharani so popular? And one simple explanation is that people are getting something from it. I mean, a lot of the people who are chanting the Great Dharani are not particularly, you know, uh, uh, well, they may be very devout Buddhists, but they're a lot of the people who chant the Great Dharani are doing so with the intention of getting helping. They want help from Avalokiteshvara, and so there's a oh, in the email that I sent out, there's an interesting quote from Zen Master Sheng Yen. So Sheng Yen is a Chinese Buddhist Zen master. He's been dead for several years now. Um, he also practiced the Great Dharani very diligently. In fact, he did so Zen Master Sung San famously did a 100-day retreat where he chanted the Great Dharani 20 hours a day for 100 days. Zen Master Sheng Yen did a 6-year retreat where he chanted the Great Dharani uh, as part of his practice every day for 6 years, 21 times. I think he did it 21 times. Maybe it was 108. Um, and he also talks about the uh, that. So when you talk about getting rid of bad karma, one thing that is any kind of difficulty that we experience in practice. If you have difficulty with sitting meditation, if you have difficulty concentrating, if you have difficulty um, just trying to understand basic Buddhist concepts, or reading something by a Zen teacher, or a sutra or whatever, and you want to understand it better, but it just doesn't make sense. This A traditional Buddhist explanation for what's going on is you have karmic obstructions, and um, so one very popular popular is probably the right word, although it's not popular in kind of people do it. People don't love doing it though, but one popular way of getting rid of karmic obstructions is doing a lot of bowing. Um, I have bad knees and a bad back. Um, Bowing is not a, a something I can really do a lot, but I can chant the Great Dharani. Um, yeah. So anyway, if the Great Dharani is something that will it does bring uh, benefit, and so um, it will help you to overcome karmic obstacles that may be interfering with your practice. I mean, and even if you don't particularly have trouble uh, uh, with your practice, maybe you would like to practice more, but you don't have the time, or you can't organize the time, or whatever. If you spend some of your time practicing when you do have time to do it, reciting the Great Dharani, or if you learn the Great Dharani by heart, then you can do it pretty much anywhere, anytime, and it will help you to get more time, more energy, or whatever you need to practice more. But it will also help you pass tests. I've seen this for myself, people. and and you shouldn't be too. We all have um uh you know real world problems, and we shouldn't be too you know uh uh oh, we should be perfectly comfortable asking the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas for help with our lives, as well as with our with our real lives, as well as with our practice, because they can help with both. What do people think? Does it really help? Is an interesting question, and there's how can chanting the Great Dharani do anything? Does it do anything? So that's a actually quite an interesting question, and Buddhist teachers, going all the way back to the Buddha, have addressed that many times from many different angles. But the none of those explanations really make much difference unless you try it yourself and see. Yeah, good. Finally, someone is unmuted. Tom.
Yeah, so if we say a prayer, uh, we're always encouraged not to ask for something for ourselves. We're encouraged to ask for all sentient beings and not be selfish
Hmm.
in this
Yeah,
way. And yet, the reason for the great popularity seems to be
yeah.
more self-centered. This seems like a bit of uh, I don't know. It seems a bit not right somehow.
Hmm.
Uh, can you speak to that?
Yeah. Well, so um, I think that's a really good question. Um, and I think in my opinion is that that's something that we need to get over. Um, that uh, and so one, if you look at the evening bell chant, actually the evening bell chant kind of has an answer to that question built into it, because there's three levels. Some Buddhist teachers talk about three levels of motivation in our practice. And the first level of motivation, what did the Buddha start off with when he first taught in Deer Park? That he had the answer to the problem of suffering. I mean that was, and he didn't say that he had this philosophical answer that explained suffering. He said he had found a way to end suffering. Um, and so that's actually there's a reason why the Buddha taught that first, because that's the first level of motivation that people have. Um, and and actually because there's a very strong tendency, I know exactly what you're talking about, there's a very strong tendency to think I shouldn't be looking to get something for myself from from the Dharma, or from Zen, or from Buddhism, or whatever. um at the same time, uh and I mean, this is like this this is just common sense, but it also fits in with Buddhist teaching, that if you need help, you should get help. If you need help, you should ask for help. And another really, really basic fundamental teaching of Buddhism is the idea of refuge. And one of the reasons why the Buddha taught in terms of taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha is because we always seek refuge somewhere. Whenever we have difficulty, whenever we have problems, whenever are in pain, or have lost something, or want something, we look we look to something. Um, that's just, uh, why wouldn't we? I mean, and you don't have to think of it as seeking refuge, but and the literal meaning of refuge, uh, or what I always think of is refugees fleeing from a natural disaster, or someplace where there's a war going on, or violence, or something. They are going, and so some English speaking Buddhist teachers actually don't use the word refuge, they use the word safe direction. Um, and so, what is the safe direction to go in? And we always, whenever we're in trouble, we always seek that safe direction, or that place where we think that there's some solution, or where things are better. Okay. And so, um, again, that's when we suffer in the most basic. There's lots of philosophical explanations for suffering, but when we suffer in the most basic way, we know we're suffering. We don't wonder what does suffering mean, and we know that we want it to end, and we know that we want to look for something that will end it. And so that's the most basic fundamental motivation that we all have, and we shouldn't think that we're better than that, unless you are, in which case congratulations. But but I think it's important um, to to not think that we're more enlightened than we are. To realize that we have basic desire to be happy, and and accepting our own basic desire to be happy is very important, because that provides us with a way of connecting with others, because then we see that everybody else is basically just like me. Everybody else, and people can see my problems pretty easily, right? You can always see other people's problems pretty easily. You can see what other people are doing wrong much more easily than I can see what I'm doing wrong. But um, when we see other people, it's easy to uh, assume that they have bad intentions, and that's why they're acting badly. But in fact, everybody is just trying to end their own suffering and find happiness. Um, and so, looking at things in that way, and accepting the fact, I just want to be happy. and I have this list of things that are making me miserable, and and I would like some help with them. And I think you kind of have to start there. You have to accept that that's kind of a ground. That's kind of a ground to, but to not stop there. And then the next level of motivation. Of course, the ultimate level of motivation is, oh, for the benefit of all beings. But if we were only guided by that motivation, then um, we would already be I would already be much more enlightened than I am if I was even guided by that motivation most of the time, or even hardly any of the time. But uh, so the first level of motivation is just to seek help for your own suffering. Second level of motivation is to uh, so there's a middle ground between just wanting to feel better and wanting to save all beings, and the middle ground um, uh, is to really and truly understand suffering and to attain some level of realization, to not just feel better, but to have some understanding and some realization um, of what suffering is all about, and to be able to eliminate the true causes of suffering, and that's um, individual liberation. Um, you also need that. You also need the motivation for individual liberation, but then you need to add to that the realization that um, there's something better than individual liberation, which is, and by the time you get to this point, it starts getting pretty grandiose, but it's Buddhahood, um, which is Buddhahood, which is beyond just liberation for oneself. A Buddha becomes a Buddha in order to save all beings, and so even though it is kind of grandiose, um, at the end of our discussion, we're going to say it. Sentient beings are numberless. I vow to save them all, or we vow to save them all. And um, anyway, but yeah, but so I think that uh, I I would just say that the idea that we should not ask, and if you put it in terms of ask for help, but often that help comes down to asking for stuff, asking for things. And it seems like, oh no, we should be higher than that, but you have to get there, I think. I don't know. What do you think, Tom? Is that acceptable?
Yeah, I really appreciate that. The explanation itself is a little bit liberating, and I appreciate that. I like that. But then, so I'm thinking, then the next steps, right? The next two levels of motivation, and it seems also to apply. But I seem to recall Seong San saying, uh, uh, if you want to become enlightened, I think what he said was big mistake,
Yes.
and 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 yet I think here we're saying, you know, what's the motivation for that? If the motivation is because I want to be a Buddha and I want people to see that, and so
Right.
for my own self uh, worth or my own self edification, whatever. But uh, if your motivation is truly bodhicitta, to want
Yeah.
enlightenment, to help save all beings, then that seems more noble
Hmm.
and under the terms we were speaking of it, then
Yeah.
that would be a good thing.
Yeah.
And I like the way you put it as you're asking for help
Yeah.
to attain that. Yeah. So yeah, that rang true with me. Thank you for that.
Yeah. Oh, and I said that this is kind of built into the bell chant, because in the bell chant the
Yeah.
first thing that's asked for in the bell chant is to be uh, to leave hell, which means to leave the worst kind of suffering. Um, but you can be liberated from the worst kind of suffering, but still be in samsara. Okay, samsara is, there's very nice things in samsara. If you can have a very nice, comfortable situation, you could be, young, rich, and good looking. I mean, or whatever you're, because basically that's what the Buddha was. That's what Prince Siddhartha was. He was young, rich, and good looking, and everything, anything else that you could imagine that you could want. Um, but he was still stuck in the palace, that he was still stuck in samsara, and so that's the next level in the bell chant. The next thing that's the next aspiration that's expressed in the bell chant is to get out of samsara altogether, leave samsara behind. And then the final aspiration that's expressed in the bell chant is to become a Buddha and save all beings. Wonjung, one, yeah, I can't remember the exact. I can't remember. It's so short, but I can't remember it unless I'm chanting it. But become a Buddha and save all beings. That's right in the bell chant, and that's what comes at the end. Um, and it's one of the things that makes the Great Dharani such a wonderful practice, because so many people do practice it just for their own benefit. And that's one of the reasons why it's so popular. But at the same time, Zen Master Sung San taught it as the way that he attained realization. That's his great awakening came from it. And so it does it all.
Hi, Kat. Hi, Kat. It's Fatima. Can you hear me?
I yes, I can.
Sorry,
Hi, Fatima.
excuse the video. I'm in the Netherlands in a cabin,
Oh,
and
cool.
the light is a bit dodgy, and I'm on the side of the room with a plug now for my phone. But I'm
Okay.
here. It's 1:40 in the Netherlands, but it's really interesting listening to this. Just sort
Yeah.
of touching upon I was actually just thinking today, like touching upon something you were saying earlier about the medicine Buddha and the fact that we're
Hmm.
saying it. And then actually, there's all these other people who are saying it at different times in history and around the world. And that's coming to us as well, and that sort of connectedness. So sort of along those lines, could you expand a little bit on just the Great Dharani, sort of historically, how it's
Oh.
developed,
Hmm.
what groups were using it, who's actually using it at the
Oh.
moment?
Hmm.
Not in a sort of
Oh.
strict way, more just general
Yeah.
interest.
Yeah. So there are about 500 million Buddhists in the world, give or take. So just look at the Buddhist world today, and they're not evenly distributed, but there's three main schools. There's the Theravada Buddhists in the south of Asia, and they have their own chanting, which is all in Pali. And actually, when Theravada Buddhists do chanting, they call it parita chanting. They don't say mantra, they don't say dharani. Um, they call it parita, and parita means protection in Pali. And so they do, and usually when it's explained in English, they add the word blessing. So you do this chanting for blessings and protection. And so they don't do the Great Dharani. They have their own wonderful, beautiful Pali chants that they do. Um, some of which are also, there's one in particular that's a chant that's done, very, 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 very short chant that's done for women in childbirth, that is pretty much universally practiced throughout the Buddhist world. Um, but otherwise, and a lot of people anyway. So that's those people. That's maybe, I don't know, 150, 200 million out of 500 million. So the rest of the Buddhists are in, Central Asia, China, and East Asia, Vietnam, Korea, and Japan. All of those people chant the Great Dharani. Buddhists in it's practiced by the Tibetan Buddhists, which there's as many Mongolians who practice Tibetan Buddhism as there are Tibetans. And of course, there's now people all over the world who practice Tibetan Buddhism, so it's why I'm putting it in air quotes. But that's, it is legitimately called Tibetan Buddhism. But there's actually a series of talks given by, oh, I can't remember his name now, Norbu. He's the guy who he's a film. In addition to being a very famous Tibetan Buddhist teacher, he's also a film director. So he's the guy who made the film The Cup, and he's made several other films since then. He's also trained many other people. There's now students, film film students of his are now making movies. But he's also a teacher, and he has a series of, I think, 3 or 4 videos on YouTube talking about the Great Dharani, which is, because it is practiced by Tibetan Buddhists. And so it originally comes from Indian Buddhism. We don't really know that much about the ancient history of the Great Dharani among Indian Buddhists, but it came to China in the Tang Dynasty. At least by the Tang, we know that it was very popular in the Tang Dynasty because there were at least 17 different translations made of the sutra that contains the Great Dharani during the Tang Dynasty, and also in the kind of the next dynasty, which is the Sung Dynasty, is when Buddhist teachers started trying to convince people to not just chant the Great Dharani for good luck. And so they started developing various more difficult and elaborate rituals, which always centered upon repeating the Great Dharani many, many, many times. And some of those rituals would take up to 7 days. And so one of those, so as historically, those rituals come down to us in Zen Master Sung San's lineage in the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra. The Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra is basically a container for the Great Dharani. The Great Dharani is right in the middle of the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra. And actually, you can chant the Thousand Hands and Eyes Sutra in about 15 minutes or so at a reasonable pace. And you can chant along. There's lots of recordings of it. So you don't have to, it's actually a good idea. But if you do that, then what a lot of people do, and what's very, very commonly done, and what Zen Master Sheng Yen did during his 6-year retreat, he would do one of these. He didn't do the Thousand Hands and Eyes, but he would do one of these rituals that was basically a container for the Great Dharani. And then when he got to the Great Dharani, he would recite it at least 21 times every day. And yeah, so basically everybody does it. There's probably only one chant in East Asia that's more popular than the Great Dharani, which is essentially the short version of the Great Dharani, which is yeah, I mean, there's even like disco dance remix versions of this shorter Dharani. I played it a couple of classes ago anyway, but it's parts of it are very, very, very similar to the Great Dharani, but it's much shorter. Um, and it actually comes from a different sutra. There's a separate sutra that teaches a shorter version, and there's a lot of there are different versions of the Great Dharani. There's like a long version and a short version, and then the version that became popular in Korea, which is different from the ones that people do in other parts of Asia, is kind of halfway between the short version and the long version. I don't know. Anyway, so you said the word history, Fatima. So I gave a little bit of history there. I don't know. What does that kind of address what you were curious about?
Yeah, no, thanks, Kurt. That was really, really helpful because I think obviously we've all got a different approach to things. I think for
Uh-huh.
my approach, I tend to over intellectualize things a lot.
Hmm.
So what I
Hmm.
struggle with a lot in my practice is just thinking about other people. Like
Uh-huh.
I tend to analyze the text than
Hmm.
trying to rather than and
Yeah.
I was actually it's actually today I was on the plane just thinking about the Medicine Buddha Sutra and thinking, well, here's
Uh-huh.
me butchering it in the UK. And historically, there's like loads of people who have also been saying it, and they're all sitting there doing the same thing and sending the same
Hmm.
vibes. And then, as I was just thinking about the Great Dharani, just
Yeah,
who's doing it, so I can maybe bring up not images, but imagination about other people in the same boat. If that makes sense.
yeah, and so it is a wonderful way of practicing together with tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people, going back for centuries who've done this practice. And people do it. There's slightly different versions, and then there's different versions of the sutra that it comes from, and then there's different versions of these longer ceremonies that include the Great Dharani. But when you're doing the Great Dharani, you are really connecting with and 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 you're connecting with just really basic, ordinary people, like students who are chanting the Great Dharani for good luck on their test, or people who are facing whatever kind of ordinary, everyday issues or difficulties and are turning to Avalokiteshvara for help, um, which is kind of I like that, and it because sometimes there's a disconnect between what people who are not born and raised Buddhists, people who grew up in a Western culture, and this is actually very true for this is increasingly true for people who are born and raised in Asia now, because they grow up in a very westernized, very modernized, very industrialized society, um, and it's easy for them, like us, to look at ancient Buddhist traditions as just very superstitious and uh, not cool or whatever. Uh, but I think it's good to get over that too, and to participate in a practice that connects us with this really really ancient, very strong tradition of people. So it's good to think about who else is doing this chant. That's actually a good thing to think about. But it's also cool for me that I have this special connection, through my teacher and his teacher, um, in Zen Master Sung San. And I think it's really cool that there's that very specific connection, but that it is in no way, you know, we don't own it. We do, if you're a part of that Dharma family, you can claim a very special connection with the Great Dharani, but you don't have any sort of, you know, uh, claim to it that millions of other people have as well. And you can go around, if you go if once once you start once you start looking for mantras and dharanis and chants on YouTube, if you can put up with the fact that most of them are not in English, and if you can put up for the fact that a lot of them are, I don't know, the production values are sometimes not so great, or sometimes they're way overproduced. The music can be way too much or too schlocky or whatever. But there's lots of cool, and you can just I like this recording of this mantra, and just do it just for that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's kind of neat to have a little bit more direct connection with the tradition that mantra or dharani is part of, I think. And to have people that you can go to and chant it together with and talk about it with.
Did you want to do did you want to do the Thousand Hearts and Eyes? I think we did that once. I think for the chanting evening last summer when you said it
Yes.
like
So
I further divers. That was so beautiful because I remember
yeah.
actually listening to that
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
thinking,
Yeah.
oh no, there's no English translation here. But actually, it was lovely because that was just so lovely just hearing the words, and I thought that's
Hmm.
magical, but I don't
Yeah.
actually know what this is, and I was very annoyed. But I looked it up
It's
afterwards and I thought that's cool.
Yeah, so the Thousand Hands and Eye Sutra has all kinds of stuff in it. So in addition to the Great Dharani, and it has a couple of other things that are taken from the sutra that the Great Dharani is taught in, but it also has a bunch of other stuff that's put in there as well. And it ends with the four great vows, and and taking refuge in the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And it begin, and it has a bunch of different mantras, other mantras in it. So yeah, it's really nice, interesting uh, chant, uh, and it's part of this long tradition of trying to convince people to take their Great Dharani practice up to the next level and not just chant it for good luck. And a lot of this, there's a great book called Kuan Yin, The Chinese Transformation of Avalokiteshvara by a Chinese American woman whose name I can never remember. I wish I could, but the title of the book is Kuan Yin, The Chinese Transformation of Avalokiteshvara, and she talks a lot of what I've been saying is in that book because her teacher was Sheng Yan, and so she's a really very serious scholar, and so she's not preaching Buddhism, but she is coming from the perspective both as someone who was born and raised in as a Buddhist and who is a practicing Buddhist, but who's also a very highly trained, skilled scholar, and investigates things as a scholar. And so she because of Master Sheng Yen's her teacher's connection with the Great Dharani, she was very interested in finding the history of it, and she talks about it quite a bit in that book. And of course, and that's another thing that's really great about it. Easy to overlook is that the Great Dharani is very closely connected with Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion, which it's a wonderful way of strengthening your connection with Avalokiteshvara, with Kwanzaa Bosal, which is another way of looking at kind of taking it to the next level. Yeah, I need help. I need help from Kwanzaa Bosal, but I also want to be closer to Kwanzaa Bosal, and I want to be more like Kwanzaa Bosal. You can and feel closer to Kwanzaa Bosal, and it is a good way to accomplish that.
Kung Fan Yu, does that sound like the woman's name that wrote that book?
Yeah. You Googled it, didn't you?
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you. Say it again.
Kung Fan Yu.
Yeah, that sounds right.
Or Yu Chung Fang. I'm not sure which comes first.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
use the
Right.
name that you can search for. YU.
And if you look, you could even find it for a free download as a PDF, which I have, but I purchased the book. It's really a valuable resource to have. It is the book on Kwanzaa Bosal or Kuan Yin.
I could say something about what we've just been talking about.
What's that?
Because my motivation for chanting the Great Dharani started when I first learned about Kuan Buddhism and Sun San, and I heard about his story. I met him, heard about his story, and I heard about this chanting this Dharani. I thought, well, that sounds like a good idea. If it worked for him, why not? And so I did. I got a little cassette tape from Providence and started doing that. And so my motivation was kind of scattered there. And I've noticed the motivation change a lot over the years. And one of the things it's taught me is that what you think your motivation is usually isn't what it is, but it can be useful.
Yeah.
Whatever gets you there is good. But then you might find out, oh, wow, you might notice that, you were seeking refuge and you didn't even know it. like that. But then when I'd only been chanting it for a few weeks when there were some Asian kids at school, and I was walking by them on the sidewalk, and I heard this chant, and I went, "Wait a minute!"
Yeah, right.
And they were chanting it together, getting ready to go to a test. Uh,
Hmm.
but I didn't even look into what it meant or anything until you started
Mm.
giving me that
Hmm.
idea that you could, some 20 years ago. And because Sung Song said, don't worry about that,
Right,
what it
right.
means. And so this is all really cool to learn
Right.
about even more. I mean, even 40 years down the road, it's never ending. It's fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is possible to look into the meaning, and Zen Master Sung San always told people that it can't be translated. It doesn't have any meaning in any literal sense. And I always told people that. For years I told people that. I was leading groups where we would come together and chant the Great Dharani. People say, "What does this mean?" I said, "Can't be translated." And then I was sitting with a guy who happened to be Indian, who spoke Hindi and also knew some Sanskrit, and he said, and he started pointing out words in the Great Dharani that he recognized. And he said, so it's not, it can be translated, at least parts of it can. Um, so I
Yeah.
said, really? Yeah.
But it clears your mind. That's all the
Yeah.
translation you really need.
Yeah. Hmm. Right.
Just as an aside, did you know that Google Translate offers Sanskrit as something you can translate to and from?
Hmm. There, sometimes Google Translate does a pretty good job. The problem with the Great Dharani is that it's basically people in East Asia have been playing the telephone game with the Great Dharani for 1,000 years. And this is a part it, for Dharanis and mantras that are mostly only known to scholars and very advanced, teachers and whatever, they can remain fairly pure. But once everybody starts chanting something, it's it's out of it's out of control of the experts. Um, and so the mispronunciation of the original Sanskrit has evolved because of the popularity of the chant. And and so the first thing that has to be done in order to translate it is to recreate the original Sanskrit, which has not been done with the Korean version of the Great Dharani um, yet. And I don't even know if anybody's working on it. But the version of the Great Dharani that everybody else chants, it has been done, and it's very similar. It's very similar to what we chant. Um, anyway, it's a fascinating rabbit hole. And if you're going to think about stuff, it's actually not so bad to think about practices that connect you to, your tradition. It's not, you got to do the practice, okay? Uh, and as long as you're doing the practice, the thinking about it can be to some extent useful, as long as it's grounded in the actual practice. Especially for people who like to think about things. Trying to force yourself not to think about things doesn't work.
It's quite funny, Kurt. I think it's like this sort of, I think with all traditions, you've got this dynamic tension between
Hmm.
enthusiastic. I mean, if I was left to chant, I'd just do it enthusiastic and it would turn into something completely different. So it's good that
Uh-huh.
you've got that balance, I suppose, between the intellectual tradition, keeping it straight, and then maybe
Hmm.
just things change a little bit, I suppose, as well. And just that sort of that interaction seems quite important to me.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't believe in so some people, well, this happens sometimes with some chants. People want to say, oh, that's not the correct Sanskrit and here's how you should chant it. I learned to chant the Great Dharani the way Zen Master Sung San chanted it, and that's good. Not only is that good enough for me, that's what I want, because anything else is not. I don't feel the same connection to. But if somebody wants to um, come up with a proper Sanskrit version of it, that's fine. And one of these times when we get together to talk about the Great Dharani, we can talk about. In fact, I'll try to remember to send out some an email with some information, so that you can look at uh, attempts to, or actually successful attempts to translate versions of the Great Dharani, and even like what certain parts of it, like the very beginning of the Great Dharani, when we say Shimyo Jangu De Dharani, that's the title of it, and that actually has a very clear meaning. And then Shimyo Jangu De Dharani, Namo Ra Dana Dara Ya Ya, means I pay homage to the three jewels. And it's a very standard way of starting Dharanis. Um, and there's more after that, but just it's important to. I think it's important to know that it does have meaning. It's also important to know that you don't have to study the meaning, but it's also important to know that if you really feel like studying the meaning, you can, but you'd better be practicing it if you do. So it's a little after 8. We usually go for about an hour. Um, so it's been about an hour. Uh, Anybody have anything you still want to bring up or talk about? I wouldn't want to cut, discussion off. Yeah.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. This has been really wonderful. I just with regards to chanting practice, I
Hmm.
like every day I chant the four great vows, the five
Hmm.
remembrances, the evening bell chant in a specific time and routine, during the morning. So I had at one point worked with the Heart Sutra, but then that kind of fell away, and I'm really intrigued now to learn the Great Dharani and use it as a chanting practice. But I'm just curious how other people, practice that. I have a practice time in the morning that's set, and do people just kind of do it at a set time or anytime throughout the day? I know some songs was chanting that all the time. I was
Yeah.
just curious how other people would share about how they implement their chanting practice, if they so desire.
That's an interesting question because on Sunday, um, I gave the Dharma talk at our temple, and it was on your home practice. And I was encouraging people that when you do this, um, that you do have a set time and a set routine and a set order of whatever you are choosing to include in that practice, that you keep that order to it, and you keep the time and you keep the space, and that part of it to me always becomes sacred. And and I so that's, yes, that's how I do it. So,
Anybody else want to share their personal preferences or habits or John?
Yeah, I try to get up early and I sit for a while and then I chant.
Mhm.
And if I don't make it in the morning, having a morning practice gives me the motivation that if I miss the morning, I will get it done later on. If I didn't have the
Oh,
morning practice and I missed, then I just would miss. So, but yeah, it just seems to be the thing after sitting to start the day with. Thanks, Kurt, for putting that up on the internet for me to download and chant with.
okay.
You know, to me, this is really kind of an interesting topic on its own. And for many years, I went to up in northeastern Ohio. I went to Unitarian Universalist Church, and we had a continued discussion on ritual and the need or not need to have ritual in your life. And they were not big on ritual, and
Yeah, yeah.
I like ritual in my life. I like the structure of it, and that's kind of why I like that holding that time and holding that the content in a structure and order. Uh, so I like ritual, and that's why I choose to do it that way.
And I think it's really good to include things in your practice that you like, and even to use that as a way of approaching your practice, because you've got to find something that you're going to do, you know, and so it's, even though it's great to like chant the Great Dharani for help in your practice to remove karmic obstacles, karmic obstructions, so that you can have practice better or whatever. But then it's still up to you to do the practice, and that usually means it's up to you to figure out what to do in your practice. Um, and there's all kinds of things that you can do, you know. And I uh, right now I try to chant the homage to the three jewels and the ten the thousand hands and eyes sutra in the and the morning bell chant in the morning, and maybe some other things as well. You know, it's a lot of chanting, but I like chanting. Um, oh, so since I like chanting, that's something I'm more likely to do. So, and I can't bow, and I can sit. I can do silent sitting meditation, um, which I like doing as well. But yeah, finding time in the morning can be for me. It's really hard. Now that I'm retired, I have fewer excuses. Um, but I like what John said about how if you really set your intention to practice in the morning and then you don't get around to it, then you then have that extra motivation to make up for it by practicing later that day. And that's real. I mean, just having the intention to practice every day is a big deal. You don't want to uh, set yourself up for failure. Um, and really, the best way to not set yourself up for failure is just to never give up, right? Because as long as you don't give up, then you haven't failed. And doesn't matter how many times you don't get up in the morning or don't practice that day. And that's a teaching right from Zen Master Sung San. Try for 10,000 lifetimes, you know. Um, and every time that you try is, and there's a certain, uh, when we, if you miss a day of practice or you don't get up in the morning to practice, it's a lot like when the mind wanders in meditation and then you realize it's wandered and then you just come back, you know. And that you practice when you hadn't practiced the day before, is just coming back to your practice. And that's the most important thing, because none of us are enlightened. I'm going to go out on a limb. And so we're all going to drift away, and our minds are all going to wander. And the really learning how to come back is most important. Which is just another way of saying don't give up. Easier said than done. This is a great question, Young Shim.
Thanks everyone for sharing and for your practice. A nourishing evening.
Yeah, thanks everyone. That was actually really interesting just to hear how other people are practicing and things sort of evolving, because I sort of find it takes time for stuff to percolate with me. Like it takes time to get used to something. Once, like the Great Dharani is quite new to me, so I'm thinking, that's
Yeah.
interesting, and it'll take maybe a year to sort of
Mhm.
accustom myself to it, rather than just thinking, right, I'm immediately going to do this or do that. I've got to sort of let it filter through a little bit in my practice or thoughts.
And the way that people, ordinary, normal people like us, in Korea, they have very inexpensive little chanting books, but they're little chanting books, but they're full of chants and mantras and things, and you just kind of have to decide what you're going to do. And it says um, right on the cover of these chanting books, it always says, chanting practice that you can do even by yourself. uh, which I love that they say that. It sounds kind of funny. Uh, yeah, but and it also says chanting practice that will help you to accomplish your aspiration, that you can do even by yourself. Okay. Should we do one last little bit of recitation practice and say the 4 great vows together now? I'll take that as a yes. Let's see. Here we go. Share. Okay. Sentient beings are numberless, we vow to save them all. Delusions are endless, we vow to cut through them all. The teachings are infinite, we vow to learn them all. The Buddha way is inconceivable, we vow to attain it. May whatever excellent qualities we have gained from this practice be extended for the benefit of all beings. Thanks, everybody. It's been really wonderful talking. And we'll meet again next week
Yeah.
and just chant.
Thank you so much for these. I just love being part of this.
Yes, thank you so
Yeah,
much.
I I think we all feel the
Thank you.
same, Tom. Thanks. Good night,
Good night.
Night, everyone.
or
Thank you. Bye.
whatever time it is wherever you are.